I marched in the first Pride parade I ever attended, and with the exception of 1 year, I have marched in every Pride I've attended since then. I was a college sophomore at my first Pride, and I drove down from Ames with a couple of people from our UU Young Adults group. We reached out to this congregation, First Unitarian, to ask if we could join the group in their parade. I had never, until that first Pride, seen so many other queer and trans people all in one place, and I was elated. My whole being felt like it was buzzing so softly for the rest of the evening and my drive home. I share this because I think it really shares what Pride means to me. I have almost always celebrated by marching in a parade with people like you, people like us, who are members of this tradition that has held me so closely as a queer trans person. Marching in Pride for me is a religious observance, a spiritual practice. As my feet hit the pavement walking through the East Village, I feel my existences as a queer person and as a religious person come together in an incredibly nurturing way. And then the parade and the party are over, and I'm still queer, and I'm still religious. These existences carry out in my life far beyond this day in June. Throughout the year, with intent and without, I reflect on the lives of the forerunners of our movements. So when Reverend Aaron and I were planning this service, I wanted to honor some of the ancestors and the elders who have made LGBTQ liberation movements what they are today. On this Pride weekend in Des Moines, nearly 50 years since the Stonewall uprising in New York, I wanted to share their lives and stories, what they teach us, and why they matter. These stories begin with another. 50 years ago, in the early hours of Saturday, June 28th, 1969, a fight broke out on Christopher Street in Manhattan. In those hot, early summer hours, police raided the Stonewall Inn, using the excuse that the establishment didn't have a liquor license. The deeper reality, however, was that the state liquor authority wouldn't give licenses to establishments that catered to openly homosexual patrons. And by the late 60s, the Stonewall Inn had become one of the country's largest gay businesses, and one of the few, if not the only, in New York to allow men to dance with each other. Like many gay bars at the time, it was a frequent target of police raids, sometimes monthly. While the managers of many bars could usually predict when a raid would happen, they didn't that night. In the raid, a cop hit someone, and many were arrested for not wearing clothes appropriate for their real sex, a rule police enforced at that time. What ensued was a riot. Miss Major Griffin Gracie, a Black trans activist who was there, described the riot saying, "People think, oh, just one night of mayhem. It was 3 nights of absolute terror. It didn't just happen on one day." Because people were fed up. The times were different. Everybody was in an uproar over the war, over the treatment of blacks, over the treatment of women. Everybody wanted their piece of whatever the American dream was at that time. And our community and the gays and lesbians were no different. And so it was just a feeling of, well, tonight we're going to do something. Patrons fought back, and community members tended to each other's wounds, physical and emotional. This was not the country's first gay riot. Compton's cafeteria riot broke out 3 years earlier in San Francisco under similar circumstances. But it was a weekend which in later decades consecrated June as LGBTQ Pride Month, a time for festivals and celebration, for remembering who we are and where we've come from. Today, during Des Moines' own Pride celebration, we turn our hearts and our minds to reflect on the ancestors of queer and trans liberation movements. Together, may we consider what their examples teach us of resistance, of beauty, of who we are, and where we have come from. That when true beauty is summoned, we are rewarded with a feeling of safety and well-being. We are granted a reprieve from confusion. We are ushered into peace. Because isn't that what is so often taken away from us by a culture that devalues us? Today, we gather in this space with some things in common. As we reflect on the lives and the examples of the ancestors of summer, may we reflect on what we will carry forward from this hour. A word, a prayer, a memory. At the end of each pair of reflections, we'll take a moment to pause in reflection, and we will sing the second verse of the hymn Breaths, which we sung earlier, together as a refrain.
Marsha P. Johnson was born in August 1945 in New Jersey. A resident of Manhattan as an adult, she and a group of friends were out for a party, making their way to Stonewall the night the cops raided it. An active presence in the riots, in their aftermath, she became involved with the Gay Liberation Front, and later with her lifelong friend Sylvia Rivera, they formed the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. STAR for short. Marsha and Sylvia were homeless, and they saw many trans youth on the streets. Sylvia said, "Shelter was a big problem for trans youth. Marsha and I always sneaked people into our hotel rooms, and you can sneak 50 people into 2 hotel rooms." They decided to form STAR and offer shelter, food, clothing, education, whatever people needed. They began with a trailer, and about 20 youth were living in it in a parking lot in Greenwich Village. They eventually decided to get a building after they saw their shelter trailer being towed one morning with about 20 youth in it. As a drag queen and performance artist, friends and neighbors widely remembered Marsha for her fashion sense. A Black transgender activist involved with ACT UP later in life, she once reflected, "You never completely have your rights as one person till we have all our rights." Marsha died in 1992 at the age of 46. Her Latina American friend Sylvia Ray Rivera was born in New York City in 1951. She started dressing in drag at the age of 10. This was at a time before the transgender word was used. With her parents gone, Sylvia started living on the streets when she was 11 years old. Members of the local drag community took her in and befriended her. This is part of the reason she felt moved to provide housing for trans youth later in her years. In an interview about 20 years on the 20th anniversary of Stonewall, she said in an interview, "The era before Stonewall was a hard era. There was always gay bashing on drag queens by heterosexual men, women, and police. We learned to live with it because it was part of the lifestyle at that time, I guess. But none of us were very happy about it. We used to try to figure out when this harassment would come to an end. And we would always dream that one day it would. And we prayed and we looked for it. We wanted to be human beings. In the same set of interviews, Seymour Pine was one of the police officers who was also present that night, and he shared, "In 1968, I was assigned as deputy inspector in charge of public morals in the 1st Division in the police department, which covered the Greenwich Village area. It was the duty of public morals to enforce all laws concerning vice and gambling, including prostitution, narcotics, and laws and regulations concerning homosexuality. The part of the penal code that applied to drag queens," he said, stated, "being masked or in any manner disguised by unusual or unnatural attire or facial alteration, or one who loiters, remains, or congregates in a public space with others so masked." Before Stonewall, Officer Pine recalled, the police would show up with just 2 officers for a crowd of 200. But after Stonewall, well, he said actually before, you tell them to leave and they leave. And you say, "Show me your identification." And they all take out their identification and they file out, and that's it. And you say, "Okay, you're not a man, you're a woman." Or vice versa, and you wait over there. I mean, this was a kind of power that you had, and you never gave it a second thought. But that night in June, he said, one drag queen, as we put her in the car, she opened the other door on the other side and jumped out. At which time we had to chase that person, and when we caught him, we put him back in the car, and he made another attempt to get out of the other door, and then the other door, and at that point we just had to handcuff him. And from this point on, things began to get really crazy. Sylvia said, "Here this queen is going completely bananas, jumping on the windshield, hitting it, and the next thing you know, a taxi cab was being turned over. The cars were being turned over, windows were shattering all over the place, fires were burning around the place. It was beautiful, it really was, it was beautiful." Officer Pine said, "For those of us in public morals, after the Stonewall incident, things were completely changed from what they had previously been. They suddenly were not submissive anymore. They now had gained a new type of courage, and it seemed as if they didn't care anymore about whether their identities were made known. We were now dealing with human beings." Sylvia shared in this interview, "I'm a 38-year-old drag queen. I can keep my hair long. I can pluck my eyebrows, and I can work wherever the hell I want. And I'm not going to change for anybody. If I changed, then I feel I'm losing what 1969 brought into my life, and that was to be totally free." Sylvia and Marcia founded STAR together and the Shelter for Homeless Transgender Youth and Adults. She described herself as a revolutionary, a radical. She engaged in Puerto Rican and Black youth activism, the women's movement, the fight for transgender rights, including recognition and fuller inclusion of trans people in the LGBT community and movement. She died in 2002 at the age of 51, with her partner Julia Murray at her side. New York City announced a few weeks ago that Marcia Johnson and Sylvia Rivera are to be honored as leaders of the LGBTQIA rights movement with a monument to be commissioned and later installed in Greenwich Village, a block away from the Stonewall Inn. We light a candle for Marcia. Marcia, you never hesitated to give of yourself, whatever you had, great or small. In your memory, may we become willing, more willing, to give what we have, what we can share. May we remember that our lives and liberation are truly bound up in one another. Sylvia, we light a candle in your honor. You were cared for by so many, and you cared for so many. In your memory, may we take the nurturing and care that our beloved people have given us, and may we give it back into the world. May we care for and listen to those people who so often go uncared for.
This world must break, must warp, split, splinter into a million pieces. We are a stream of bodies sighing against old walls, our desire fed by every slice of sunrise. Aren't you dying to know what lives on the other side of this place? Pride is empty as long as trans women are forced across borders and into men's prisons and detention centers, as long as all three live up to their names. Nothing new will grow in this soil. We must river and flood everything. We must love unfamiliar until everyone is safe. Stormé de Larverie was born in 1920 in New Orleans. In her early life, she was a singer and performance artist and was involved in the entertainment industry throughout her adult life. In the 50s and 60s, Stormé toured with a drag troupe called the Jewel Box Revue as their sole drag king. She was in Manhattan the weekend of the Stonewall Riots and recalled being the first person a cop struck and the first person to resist and strike back. Following Stonewall, she became involved in the formation and leadership of the Stonewall Veterans Association, an organization comprised of the patrons present at the night of the raid, with the aim of community building and preserving LGBTQ history. She died in 2014 at the age of 94. Zazu Nova is now seldom remembered, but was present in much of the gay and transgender liberation work of 1960s New York. A staunch Unitarian, she was born in upstate New York in the 1940s and lived in Manhattan in the 60s. Her community remembered her as one of the trans women forming the vanguard of Stonewall, along with Marsha P. Johnson and Jackie Ormona. She was involved also with the Gay Liberation Front, a group formed following Stonewall to fight for an end to discrimination against gay and gender non-conforming people, while espousing a political platform which was anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Storme, yours was a life of great art and beauty, and one of great and present activism. In your memory, may we find what is beautiful in our lives, and may that beauty fortify us in resisting what is unjust. Zazu, you, along with so many, have so often been forgotten in our histories. May we remember you and your righteous anger now. May we heed the prophetic words and actions of the people at our margins today, that they may never be forgotten.
Raymond Castro was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico in 1941 and moved with his mother to New York City when he was 5. As a young gay man, he was a frequent patron of Stonewall and was there the night of the uprising. While not often remembered as a central figure, he was one of the first to resist police arrest, and his actions helped inspire others to resist as well. And together, as more and more people resisted, they turned a typical raid into a pivotal moment in LGBTQ consciousness. At the 40th Annual Gay Pride Parade, Castro said, "A lot of people, especially the young ones, they have no inkling what Stonewall is. They think gay pride is just a big party. None of this would have been possible if it wasn't for 1969. I had no idea that I was going to be involved in history making, and I would do it all over again." Raymond spent much of his life after Stonewall in Long Island and in Florida as a baker and a cake decorator. He died in 2010 at the age of 69. Miss Major Griffin Gracie was born on the south side of Chicago in 1940. She moved to New York as a young woman and was active in both the Stonewall Uprising as well as community organizing that followed. An older trans person and a mother figure to countless LGBTQ young people, Miss Major is an elder of the queer rights movement and continues to build her legacy even today. A lifelong activist, her work has been deeply impacted by her experiences and those of people in her communities. She has worked for prison abolition, for transgender rights. She has served more recently as the first executive director of the Transgender, Gender Variant, Intersex Justice Project. In the last few years, she has founded a retreat and education center in Little Rock, Arkansas, where she now resides. Raymond, you answered the call of love when you resisted. In your memory, may we be quick to action when action is needed. Miss Major, unlike the other ancestors we have remembered today, you are still alive, still living and loving fiercely, still an activist, still loving and working for your communities. May we as a community listen to and act in the example of people like you, Miss Major. With persistence, may we share our love and work for the dignity of all.
To the trans ancestors and elders who have guided us here, we honor your legacy with new celebrations. May our bodies persist. Let them shine whole and well. May our minds calibrate to the call of the universe. Let our protest songs transfigure to peace hymns. Let our cultural knowledge produce nourishment. May our homes bustle warm and abundant with love. May our communities flourish despite borders. Let our love quake opening any lingering shackle. Let our joy obliterate any festering contempt. As we bind each other closer, we manifest futures more possible. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of meaning, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and out into all the world.